Koen Salemink who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen. I've never said that.
Groningen, yes.
He's in the Department of Cultural Geography. As I always say, there's not enough geographers around RGU, so we'll speak of another one. He's over for a visit at the James Hutton Institute, but this talk has been organised as part of the GPACTRA project, in which RGU and the University of Groningen are partners. GPACTRA is short for Green Passenger Transport in Rural Areas. Within GPACTRA, Koen is going to be working with Rich Ling and I on some research. We're looking to compare transport innovation, which is being embedded in a range of transport demonstration projects. And we're looking at each innovation in terms of how much change there is from business as usual and how much change is required from transport stakeholders looking to adopt or scale up this innovation, and that change in terms of technological change, institutional change, operational change, or social change. And the second thing we're going to look at, once you've done that in terms of collaboration, is look at international transferability between different partner jurisdictions, because each European country has distinct governance and legislative regime for transport in terms of how it's planned, run, regulated, owned, financed, and funded. So an initiative that might work in Holland might not be transferable to Scotland. There's an ICT-based solution that works quite well in Germany, might not encounter too many governance barriers in Norway. So that's kind of the second area where Koen and I are going to collaborate. But today he's going to talk about rural mobility, deprivation and innovation. So, over to you.
Thank you, David. Well, the introduction, I think, says it all. Thanks for coming. Small groups usually give good discussion, so that's good, I think. Today what I'll be talking about is, let's say that the empirical basis for things are more in the background, and I'm trying to make an overall argument about rural innovation and rural transport and mobility. So I'll try to make an argument based on the work I've done, but the empirics and the methods are a bit in the background. But if you'd like to hear more about that, I'm happy to explain, of course. It's about achieving a rural scope, because I think that's often missing if you look at transport policies and mobility policies in general. We think from the city, then we start, because that's where the biggest demand is, where the biggest groups are, and more cynical, where the biggest group of voters live. So then you adjust your policy effort to that. But I think there are quite some differences between urban-led and rural-led policies. There are different ways of communicating your ideas. There are different ways of to address the needs that are there. The needs itself are different, so we need to have some sort of geographical tailored policy, I believe. Some people say that it's a market rationale that's dominant in urban areas, whereas the social innovation and more bottom-up side is more dominant in rural areas. But you could question whether that's a false dichotomy. If you look at certain cities where a lot of bottom-up, grassroots movements are actually being quite successful, whereas on the other hand, some market-led initiatives might work in the rural. So this sort of dichotomy, and maybe a false dichotomy, might be in my talk, and I'm happy to hear input about that as well. Well, starting where it all came from, I've worked in an Interreg 4B project before, and now we're in Interreg 5B, as you can see on the banner. It was called iTract, and I always need to look at what the acronym stands for, because it's a huge one. Improving transport and accessibility through new communication technologies. So what the idea was of some technicians and engineers, as in if we improve our communication, especially our online communication, about mobility, about transport, this will hugely impact the mobility, accessibility, connectivity of these rural places. Second of all, you could think of online platforms like car sharing and pooling resources, and that would make it possible to combine certain streams, and then you would have a more efficient transport system. Now, what we came up with was designing certain apps and ICT infrastructure to make this happen. So what we thought to do is what if we tried to give people travel advice in a unified way, instead of just one app that is maybe for first, or the other is for Stagecoach, or the other is for this region and for that region, etc. Combine it and make sure, and combine it multimodal. Also, maybe if you can have some car sharing or whatever, combine it all in one. Now, what does this What did this mean? Sometimes if you would fill something in on a Friday afternoon, you wanted travel advice, this is what came out. The next bus leaves Monday morning. So you can really have nice, fancy ICT applications to think to improve mobility, but quite often it shows the lack of mobility. That was a huge flaw in the thinking at the start, and maybe also it was part of the flaw in the project that it's difficult to really address these fundamental structural problems just with Interact budget. So it was sort of a wake-up call for many people in the project, because we had a lot of technicians showing all kinds of apps they made and sort of ICT architecture to show how the transport system in San Francisco could be put into this app, and it looked really nice and really fancy, but if you applied it, for example, in one of the regions, the Yorkshire Dales, that was completely different. So this could be the answer you got, as in the next one leaves Monday morning, so find a pub to stay, or no data. There was another thing that's problematic in rural regions, and that's the reception of mobile data and digital connectivity in general. So you can think of really high-tech applications to improve the information about the mobility, but if the basic digital connectivity is not there, what are you improving? So these were huge flaws in the project, but also huge learning experiences for a lot of policymakers that were involved. As in, okay, we really need to think differently, because they came with the urban mindset to improve rural mobility. And this is a very famous picture from a Dutch television series, sort of Breaking Bad meets the rural living in Groningen, Holland's Hope, Hope in Holland. And here you see a bus driver somewhere in the area of Delfzijl, I think, so in the northeast of Groningen, looking for some reception because he has to get in touch with the main office because something's wrong with his bus. Again, this is sort of a nice way to exemplify what the problems are in some rural regions. And to be honest, the United Kingdom is one of the worst examples in Europe when it comes to the reception and the quality of mobile data in rural regions. It's getting better. I mean, I was doing a walk on Sculty Hill near Bankery a couple of weeks ago. I had some 4G in Bankery. As soon as you move out towards Sculty Hill, it's gone, and that's a very touristy part. Once you go further into the Cairngorms, it's all done. But these are very touristy places, so you have a lot of people visiting that. And if you want people not to use their car but go in with a bus, because the bus connections are there, you need to have some form of information for these people as well, but it just doesn't function with the current infrastructures. So problem one is matching supply and demand for mobility. This is a huge problem for achieving rural mobility and improving it. And I would go as far to state that not much has really changed since the book of Malcolm Mosley in 1979. Accessibility to Rural Challenge, based on his work he did in Norfolk. It worked really well in the Netherlands as well, because Norfolk is landscape-wise a bit like the Netherlands, you could say. Not as similar as Lincolnshire might be, but it's rather flat. You have some market towns, a bigger central city, still somewhat populated, and a lot of rural businesses around. Heavily based on the time geography of Hegestrand, for those who are interested in it. So it's looking at how does every day of a person look, and then see where they need to move and why and at what moment, and how can you combine the movement of these people when going to certain activities. And what he proposed is going from actual demand, so the demand that is effectively measured, or in another way of saying it, moving from where supply meets demand at this moment, so the effective demand, to the potential demand. This is not latent demand. This is not as in, it might be there, we might earn money from this, but we know there is a potential, and we know there are people with extra mobility needs, but we can't serve them. And they're scattered over all kinds of places. But since a rural business case is difficult to form, this is sort of a potential demand we're not looking at. And what Mosley proposes is to come up with a people-link activity model, as in that people live somewhere in a village, and it might be that they just live and sleep there. And it might be that the supermarket is in a different village, or their sports club, or where they work, it might be completely somewhere else. But they have to do an activity somewhere, and it's thinking from this. Instead of getting major overarching network streams that sort of people have to adapt to. So he came up with the library on wheels and all that kind of things. And I was really happy to see that one of the bigger Scottish banks still has a bus, minibus thing, that goes into the countryside to deliver banking services. We would never have that in the Netherlands, but it really resembled, I think, what Mosley proposed with sort of the Meals on Wheels and the Books on Wheels, and etc. for rural areas. So this is a problem, matching the demand with some decent supply that also makes sense from a sort of financial point of view. Another one is, as I spoke about before, is the digital connectivity. Potentially, really good broadband might replace a lot of physical moves you have to make. If broadband is good and people know how to use it, they might actually not have to go into hospital 20 miles away. They could have a talk with their diabetes carer about the things they put on in an app, and everything could work and they don't have to travel. So it might save you the hassle. You can stay at home and the proper brew tastes better at home anyway, so why would you want to go to a hospital, to an expensive cafe as well? So it could be a solution to the rural remoteness. So these communication infrastructure, the digital communication infrastructure, is a sort of essential ingredient in mobility strategies. It's moving towards that direction. Yet in rural areas, it's either absent or completely inadequate. If you're in market towns or smaller villages, it's still okay. Once it comes to smaller hamlets and outside villages, it's really bad. And this is what Malecki, a famous American geographer, calls the rural penalty. I've written something about it myself as well. There's a lot of words here, but what it's about that there's no business case. Service levels in rural areas are generally lower or of a lesser quality because there is a business case way of thinking among market players. So if it's just something that should be delivered by the market, it's about can we make some money there, and money is always scarce, or at least you always want to make a lot of money, meaning that you go for the bigger business cases first. So we all know that mobile internet was first developed, for example, in the bigger cities, and then we came to 4G, and again that started in the bigger cities, and we can wait for 5G for quite a while, I think, in rural areas. So this is just the market logic. But also when I talk to my students, I also teach quite a bunch of things in Groningen. I always say the rural is where governments start to think about the business case, as in where it becomes critical, as in it might be that we can't really democratically justify to spend money on this because we think we lose too much money per passenger trip or per client served or whatever. And this is the rural penalty because it can be really nice to live in the rural, and of course being remote, and if you're fit and if you have enough money, it's like a idyllic place to live. But if you just happen to live there because your family roots are there, or because your farming business is there, or just simply because you grew up there in a mining town but your parents became unemployed and now you sort of don't have the mobility and the capability to move out, then it's completely different. But then you're part of this business case calculation of the government as well. And this is where sort of several levels of deprivation start to intersect. So it's the digital connectivity where it meets the sort of little bus past Ribblehead in the Yorkshire Dales towards Hawes. So this was I did quite a few field visits to the Yorkshire Dales, and it's quite interesting to see all these little community buses. And there's another sort of problem in the thinking about digital connectivity in mobility policies, because first of all, it's a core ingredient. In a way, it is a condition to have proper mobility policies in place, proper information, making sure that, well, like I said, people can stay at home instead of traveling somewhere. So it's a sort of a condition to have a proper, to enable the innovative mobility. But at the same time, a lot of people, especially in the more urban-led policies, it's seen as a sort of end goal, where we're in this space of flows, where we're part of all kinds of streams, networks, nodes, hubs, where digital connectivity is the basis for all things. And you see that people juggle with this, especially policymakers, as in, are we using this as a condition, or is this something to strive for at the end that we really want to achieve? And they're mixed up. And it makes sort of half-cooked policies every now and then. We all talk about the digital economy, that it's really important and that it's a boost that the country needs, and this is throughout Europe. But digital society is something we might want to be a bit wary there, because we don't know whether every person likes this, and then so, which is fair enough, because I really believe not everyone is as ready for this digital society as we hope they are. And also a lot of people don't want it, so the deliberate non-users we should not forget. But we're sort of moving towards this end goal of a digital society but somewhere halfway we're mixing condition and angle up, I think. We're dealing with this in another Interact project as well, in the Cora project, connecting rural areas, so it is a nice intersection of things. And what we see there again is that rural areas are on the wrong end of a certain divide. It's about the urban-rural divide, and it's about service levels in general, transport, digital connectivity, etc. All of a sudden you see that service levels drop. This is a general macro pattern in which, and within this pattern, the UK is a bit different, especially parts of England are different, because around really well-off cities you see some nice green belts and some commutable rural areas where the service levels, you might argue, are the highest of all. There you get the proper high-quality advanced bus connections. I'm thinking Cults, Peter Coulter, these kind of things, where you see the good bus connections with Wi-Fi on board going there because a lot of people live there and use it, actually. Many children of richer people, so to speak, they go into town and they go back, and there's a business case for that, but as soon as you move further out, this is where really the divide starts. So there's a poor material connectivity, that's a sort of general pattern, but again, the UK is slightly different here and there. The network rollout is problematic because it's costly, and we see it with fixed and mobile things. So if you really want to make a physical network, then it's quite obvious that you suffer from a lot of high costs, but even with mobile networks, you need some sort of physical network under it to serve it, and then it's also costly. And the general assumption, especially by academics, sort of is that in rural areas there's a lower adoption of certain technologies. I would argue that's a different adoption pattern. It's not like people in the rural are completely ignorant about digital technologies. If you would go and talk to the sort of stereotypical person in the rural, the farmer, the dairy farmer or someone, we always think, oh, they're not into digital things. Well, go and look at their robots for milking the cows. Go and look at how they communicate with the government about their ventures. They're really digitally savvy in a lot of ways, but they have different adoption patterns, and they're completely different from adoption patterns in urban areas. So it's different. It's not necessarily that it's not there, but we need to recognize that this pattern is there. So we see a lot of problems, a lot of potentials maybe as well, but it's mixing up, and we're mixing up things, I think. But we also see communities responding to this. Now again, here's the little white bus, which is or was, leave that in the middle for now, a community initiative in the Yorkshire Dales, around Hawes and Ribblehead again. And it's community drivers making sure that people can go. So it's a traditional, hang on, let's start again. The Settle to Carlisle Railway, nice, touristy. It brings you to Garsdale, to Hawes, Giggleswick, all kinds of places. But once you're there, you're at a station that's sort of at a folly location. So the old mining locations there are now gone, but the station is still high up. And then the village is a couple of miles away. So this last mile transport was never really properly served by public transport. So what you see is that people from the village who see the economic interest and the community interest, they think, okay, let's start this our own initiative and make sure people, that it's like 8 or 9 times that this train arrives there during the day. Let's make sure that people can travel this last mile and make sure that we have some volunteers in place and that we can drive them into the village. Really good plan, I think, and really proactive in trying to do something about the immobility. The other example here is Bürgerbus from northern Germany. Again, it's with volunteer drivers, I think mostly driving around all the people to stay mobile, visit family, visit sports activities, etc. Two completely different kinds of initiatives in the way they are regulated and the way they are supported. They try to do the same thing, but if you look at the regulatory frameworks in the UK and in Germany, they're completely different. But still, they manage to come up with somehow the same sort of initiative to deal with the problem. So it's actually, if you have problem A and you have solution X for it, it seems quite logical, and if you would not have attention for the regulatory framework, you would think, oh, this should be transferable to all kinds of countries. But if you look at the trajectory that both initiatives had to go, and all the regulations and all the barriers they had to jump over, then you see the differences. But still, they come up with the same sort of solution, because this certain need this kind of solution. How we get there, we don't care. And these active people go and do that. But then again, there's a fair question, I think, whether this is sustainable. If we ask these kind of collective or public tasks from volunteers. Citizens' initiatives, collective action, sharing economy, all really interesting, but regional differences really make a difference here. Some regions have highly skilled people who are able to deal with the policy issues or the financial issues. Some people have a pool of volunteers that are able to drive and willing to do that and still fit enough, and in some regions you just won't find these people. Or if they live there, they're not tied into the community that wants to do it, because they're newcomers, they're not from there, so why should they be active? And you see that these villages struggle to come up with this. So I always warn policymakers, as in this sort of collective action is not a one-size-fits-all, it's not a panacea for solving these kinds of problems. However, in big society thinking and participation society thinking, the Dutch equivalent, we do tend to see this as the solution to these kinds of problems. But I really disagree. Regulatory frameworks are even different per county, province, or region, for that matter. The way you make the concession for things, who gets it granted, it's all different, and if you want to work within that frame, it's always a bit different. Time and energy from volunteers. You see that these initiatives are quite vulnerable, so if one volunteer or two volunteers happen to have the flu, your mobility plan for the village collapses, and I think that's quite vulnerable. And there's another thing we've recently been investigating at the University of Groningen, which is the concept of volunteer burnout. If you get a huge burden as a volunteer for a task that was originally a public task, you have to deal with a lot of regulations, but you're also doing something that originally was something for the government, and they want to be involved with that. So you have all kinds of interests to juggle, and they have another demand to make a new policy. You need to adhere this and another regulation. Oh yeah, and some financial checks and this and that. And all of a sudden you think, you know what, bugger off. I've had it. I'm trying to do this as a volunteer. I want to bring people from A to B and maybe to C in the same day. I don't want to deal with all this kind of things. This is putting me off. And we've seen it well with sort of the other types of initiatives I've studied, community broadband initiatives. We've seen it there that people have this sort of volunteer burnout and say, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. If you really think what's best, then do it yourself as a policymaker, but don't burden me with all the things you think are good. We've seen it with care initiatives, care cooperatives, where people just say, okay, now this is where I draw the line, I'm not doing this anymore. And this is a risk, and this means that there are regional differences and is not, again, a panacea to solve these problems. But do I have some solution then for solving these problems? Because the mobility problems and the deprivation problems are still there. I mean, I can be an academic and criticize what's not good about the solutions being in place now, but that's too easy, I think, because we can always come up with criticisms of plans and criticisms of measures that are being taken. But I've drawn some learnings from iTract and from other projects I've been involved in, and I see a pattern arising in what I think constitutes a large part of the problem. Rural interest is very fragmented. It's fragmented over several borders. Sometimes it's national borders, sometimes it's provincial or regional borders, or municipal or council borders. It's multi-level. So again, if it's across borders, several institutes are involved. It's multi-actor because there are different departments or different agencies working on this. And in the end, no one really feels responsible. You can do rural proofing checks, whatever you want. If no one feels really responsible for that specific rural need, you will not really come up with a coherent solution. The question always is, who can take the lead? Who gets the authority and the mandate to do something? Who has the mandate to take decisions that actually really heavily impact another institute? Because this is the problem, it's give and take. So rural interest is sort of cracked, fragmented. And I always use this figure. It's actually, move out of the way a bit. It's what you could use for US elections as well. Actually, it's gerrymandering. Now, the makeup of the build-up structure, as you might say, is the same. Let's imagine that purple is urban and green is rural. Now, you can draw it in all kinds of ways. So in the center, at the bottom left, it might be a sort of Republican way of making sure that the conservative rural voters make you win the state. Because what you do, you make sure that the rural voters will have the majority in that sort of constituency. At the top, you have separate regions, so you end up with one urban region and the others are rural. What I'm trying to say...
Scottish model.
Yeah, yeah. The British model in general, I think, yeah. But what I try to say here is that you can draw a constitutional and sort of legal and boundaries sort of over a certain build-up structure in such a way that it caters for you. But what you see is that quite often, if you look at UK borders within the UK, borders within the Netherlands or Germany, it's quite often you have this sort of central market town or even bigger city and some surroundings. But of course, politically, and also for that reason, your policy effort will center around these cities, which is fair enough democratically because they make up the majority. But they experience different problems, different solutions that then get be the focal point of things, and then the rural surroundings are completely different, but then the sort of administrative capacity of such a county is not really geared towards the rural. So what you see, and this was quite, the Yorkshire Dales was exemplar to this, I think. It was actually the national park boundaries that made up this region. So it was partly in Cumbria, it was partly in West Yorkshire, partly in North Yorkshire. The regional transport authority that was involved was Metro, which was West Yorkshire. North Yorkshire said, well, yeah, okay, we want to be involved, but Cumbria said, what are you on about? We have the Lake District. To sort of sum it up in a general sweeping statement. But what they have is a sort of unit of working and also very much a region to work in so that you can center your policy efforts from this region. You think from this specific rural region, from these rural needs. And quite often our boundaries are completely different, and therefore we can't really think from these rural needs, although this might be needed to come up with adequate solutions that in the end might end up to be way more efficient than we're trying to deal with things now. So, a bit of academic thinking, I quite like that. I've written a policy briefing about this as well. You can find it online if you're really interested in it, based on our work in iTract. But what does it consist of, this advice? It's about rescaling the rural and refocusing on the rural to deal with this fragmented interest. It has to be geographically focused, as in specifically about rural needs, perhaps deep rural areas or just rural areas or remote rural and not commutable rural. That depends on the geographical context again. But because you do that, you get specific issues that you have to deal with. And therefore your policy effort will be geared towards these needs instead of having completely fragmented needs. And you'd have to come up with integral policy efforts, meaning that you think from multiple policy domains. Again, here's the mandate problem. You need to think from social work needs, health needs, school needs, education needs, mobility needs in general, commuter needs, whatever. They have to come together within this new geographical frame. So that you see, okay, this is apparently the target group who we're targeting here, and therefore we have to come up with these efforts instead of just one central bus line bringing you into the market town 4 or 5 times a day. And this is difficult to achieve, I realize that, but this would be the ideal situation. And I realize that this is difficult to achieve. But let's set this, from my point of view, as a sort of ideal situation in which you would make policy for rural regions. But what I see that it's connected to this, like David said, within GPATRA we think about technical innovation, operational, institutional, and social innovation. And what I think we need to start reconsidering if we're thinking about rural problems is where we start and how we approach the problems. I think this is the urban market rationale. Someone has come up with a really nice fancy application or technological innovation, and they're quite sure once they've made it, there's a market for this. And then the early adopters come and then they sort of spread their idea and it diffuses throughout the city and then it sort of rolls out and it's all nicely developing. Meaning that some operations have to change because it's new technology, meaning that your institutions sometimes have to change because you need to make new rules or you need to make new settings for how to operate, and in the end, the society or the users or the market will change with that. That's sort of the traditional sequence of a lot of innovations. But I think if we really want to come up with efficient rural innovations, this should be the coherency, or I can't come up with the word. But you start from social innovation. You start from the social needs that are within a certain place. Then you look at your institutions. Are my institutions fit to make sure that I can make these social innovations work? How do I need to change my operations? Very practically. And then, what sort of technological solution can we come up with to deal with these social needs? I know this seems really straightforward, and we always claim that we work like this, that we really try to address a need. And I always hear the engineers talking, and they tell me, well, Koen, do you know if in like 100 years ago we would have asked people what they want about mobility, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And they would never come up with the idea that they wanted a car. Fair enough, but also not really fair. Because it might be that some people are actually more happy with a faster horse. And maybe you should let these people have a faster horse. It doesn't always have to be the most cutting-edge innovation to deal with the needs of people. And sometimes it's the arrogance of people who offer technologies, new technologies, and innovate, that they think, well, all people need this. I think many problems stem from this, that we think that everyone wants to live or wants to have the innovations that are used by the early adopters. I think that's a flaw in our thinking. It seems very straightforward, but if you go and look into mobility policies or care policies or wherever, many public policies, you will see that it starts with the technological innovation. If you look into healthcare, Philips or Siemens goes to a hospital, they have, of course, salespeople, and they say, look at this technology, this will really help to change your operations. And of course, they have thought about how it will change operations and where there is a potential business case for this. But only when these sort of salespersons come into this organization, they start thinking about their operations, their institutions, and what it will do to their workers. So I think we need to sort of counter this way of thinking that we always have to come, okay, this was invented within an urban context for mobility or for care or whatever, and therefore it has to roll out and diffuse into rural regions. Sometimes the needs might be different, and we need to counter this thinking. And I hope we get a bit of this counter thinking actually up and going in Gpatra. It would be nice. I see interesting things in Germany, for that matter, where they try to pool all kinds of vehicles that are present in a region. So a football club owns a van, an elderly care home owns a van, and they could host like 8 or 9 passengers, and that's great. But only 1 time a week will the vehicle be used. And then again, there are a lot of people who don't own cars, even in Germany, who want to be mobile and want to go to a market town to maybe visit someone or go to the shops, etc. And they don't have a car, and if you know the German system, it's only school buses, so it's only in the morning and in the late afternoon. So you're sort of trapped and isolated. Now, you have this potential pool of vehicles, this fleet. How would you be better able to use this fleet to serve that need? And not thinking from the technology, not coming up with something fancy. You have these vans already. How do you organize that you can make more efficient use of this? So you know the social need. You know that you have a certain fleet. You need to come up with different institutions so that you can make use of this fleet, so that you can adjust your operations, maybe as a public transport authority, and then it might not be that technologically innovative, but at least you're serving the need. We need to counter the way of thinking every now and then. It might seem a bit, well, not activistic, but ideological what I'm doing here, but I think a lot of people could benefit from this. I have one more slide where I ask you for, do you have any questions? But this sort of wraps it up from my side, and it might be more useful to leave this one, I think, as the last slide. But I'm happy to take any questions, input, thought-provoking things, whatever.